Aggression. Intentional action aimed at doing harm or causing physical or psychological pain. By this definition, we humans have proven ourselves to be a particularly aggressive species. No other animals so consistently and wantonly hit, torture, and kill members of their own kind. For centuries, philosophers have debated why this is. Is aggression an inborn phenomenon, or must it be learned? Thomas Hobbes, in his classic work Leviathan, took the view that we human beings, in our natural state, are brutes, and that only by enforcing the law and order of society can we curb what to Hobbes was a natural instinct toward aggression. In contrast, Jean-Jacques Rousseau's concept of the noble savage suggested that we human beings, in our natural state, are gentle creatures and that it is a restrictive society that forces us to become hostile and aggressive. Hobbes's more pessimistic view was elaborated in the 20th century by Sigmund Freud, who theorized that human beings are born with an instinctual drive toward life, which he called eros, and an instinctual drive toward death, thanatos, leading to aggressive actions. About the death instinct, Freud wrote, "It is at work in every living being and is striving to bring it to ruin and to reduce life to its original condition of inanimate matter." This age-old dispute about human nature prompts me to raise the following questions that I will attempt to answer in this chapter. Is aggression inborn? Is it part of our very nature as human beings? Can aggression be modified? Are women as aggressive as men, though presumably in different ways? What are the social and situational factors that increase or decrease aggression? Today, psychological scientists across many disciplines understand that aggression is both biological and learned, part of our evolutionary heritage, and so are the countervailing forces that promote altruism and cooperation. Let's look at some of the many factors that influence, or discourage, the expression of aggression. Aggression in non-human animals. To gain insight into the extent to which aggression may be innate, some scientists have turned to experiments with non-human species. Consider the common belief that cats will instinctively stalk and kill rats. More than half a century ago, biologist Xing-Yang Kuo attempted to demonstrate that this notion was a myth. By doing a simple little experiment, he raised a kitten in the same cage with a rat. Not only did the cat refrain from attacking the rat, but the two became close companions. Moreover, when given the opportunity, the cat refused either to chase or to kill other rats. Thus the benign behavior was not confined to this particular buddy but generalized to rats the cat had never met. It's not science, but some of the most popular videos and photos online are those of cross-species friendships, such as someone's dog and cat nestled in each other's paws. Although charming, Kuo's experiment do not mean that aggressive behavior is learned or that it isn't innate. It merely demonstrates that aggressive instincts can be curbed by early experience. What if an animal grows up without any contact with others of its species? Will it or won't it show aggressive tendencies when threatened? Rats raised in isolation will attack a fellow rat introduced into the cage. Moreover, the isolated rats use the same pattern of threat and attack that experienced rats use. So even though aggressive behavior can be modified by early experience, apparently in some species it needn't be learned. What can we humans learn about our own biological heritage by observing the behavior of animals with whom we are most alike genetically? Our closest genetic relatives, with whom we share 98% of our DNA, are the chimpanzee and the bonobo. Nevertheless, these primates could not be more unlike each other. The chimpanzee is extremely aggressive. Although chimps do not engage in full-scale war as humans do, male chimps will hunt and kill other chimps, sometimes torturing them and tearing them apart. Females too can be very aggressive, cunning, and mean. But the bonobo, our other close genetic relative, has been described by primatologists as more compassionate, empathic, and peaceful than chimps. Whereas the chimpanzee will act aggressively with little provocation, the bonobo is one of the least aggressive species on the planet. In fact, bonobos have been called the make love and not war ape, because whenever a potentially dangerous conflict looms, bonobos have sex, which diffuses tension. When bonobos arrive at a feeding ground, they first have communal sex and then proceed to eat peacefully. In contrast, when chimps arrive at a feeding ground, they fight over the food. Also, unlike the chimps, bonobos form female-dominated societies, keeping males in line and displaying remarkable sensitivity to others in their group. So are human beings more like chimps or more like bonobos? Those who argue that aggressiveness is built into us point to the chimps, those who argue that we are cooperative point to the bonobos. Although we humans don't share the bonobos' sexual solutions to problems, we are more adept than chimps at cooperating in a way that prevents violent resolution to disputes. Evolution has given us both a propensity to attack when we feel threatened or in competition for resources, and also strong inhibitory mechanisms that enable us to suppress aggression when it is in our best interests to do so. Culture and aggression. Human societies have not been equally warlike. In close-knit cultures that depend on cooperation for the group's survival, anger and aggression are considered dangerous and disruptive, and an offender will be ostracized or punished. Many human groups, like the Lepchas of Sikkim, the Pygmy peoples of Central Africa, and the Arapesh of New Guinea, live in cooperative friendliness, both within their own group and in their relations with others. Acts of aggression are rare. 10 At the other end of the human continuum are groups such as Nigeria's Boko Haram, who train their very youngest children to murder and die in suicide attacks. Most social psychologists, therefore, believe that aggression is an optional strategy. We humans are born with the capacity for aggressive behavior, but how, whether, when, and where we express it is learned and depends on our circumstances and culture. You may be really angry if a police officer stops you for speeding, but it is likely that you will control your temper and your behavior. 3 major lines of evidence support the view that the expression of aggression depends on the external conditions that foster or suppress it: studies of how cultures change over time, studies across cultures, and laboratory experiments. Consider the Iroquois of North America. The Iroquois lived in peace for hundreds of years as a hunting nation, but in the 17th century, growing trade with the newly arrived Europeans brought the Iroquois into direct competition with the neighboring Hurons over furs. A series of wars developed, and the Iroquois became ferocious and successful warriors, not because they were inherently aggressive, but because a social change increased competition. 11 It works in the other direction, too. Many societies that were once warlike, such as the Scandinavians or Portuguese, have become the most peaceful on the planet. Violence as entertainment now takes place on movie screens, in video games, and at sports events, and not in gladiator arenas where actual people were once torn apart to the cheers of audiences. Steven Pinker 12 has argued that over the centuries, human violence has been declining, thanks in part to the rise of nation-states that take care of decisions about war, justice, and retribution, and to the nearly universal condemnation and outlawing of slavery, gruesome punishments, and child abuse. Except for people living in war zones like Syria, Afghanistan, or Iraq, or in failed states like Somalia, human beings today are statistically less likely to encounter violence than we were in the past. Cultures of honor the malleability of violent tendencies is further reflected in striking regional differences in aggressive behavior and in the kinds of events that trigger it. Richard Nisbet 13 has shown that homicide rates for white Southern males are substantially higher than those for white Northern males, especially in rural areas. But this is true only for certain kinds of homicides, those provoked by perceived insults and by a perceived need to protect property, and only in certain areas, those that had originally been based on herding economies rather than agriculture. Why would this be so? People who depend economically on agriculture tend to develop cooperative strategies for survival. But people who depend on their herds are extremely vulnerable. Their livelihoods can be lost in an instant by the theft of their animals. To reduce the likelihood of theft, Nisbet theorized, herders learn to be hyperalert to any threatening act and respond to it immediately with force. This would explain why cattle rustling and horse thievery were capital crimes in the Old West and why Mediterranean and Middle Eastern herding cultures even today place a high value on male aggressiveness. And indeed, when Nisbet looked at agricultural practices within the South, he found that homicide rates were more than twice as high in the hills and dry plains areas as in farming regions. The emphasis on aggressiveness and vigilance in herding communities fosters, in turn, a culture of honor in which even small disputes put a man's reputation for toughness on the line, requiring him to respond aggressively to restore his status. 14 After all, if you are a farmer in Massachusetts, chances are no one is going to steal your entire apple crop, therefore, it's not as necessary to establish the reputation of being a person who will stand up and fight to protect his property. But if you are a cattle rancher, it is important to establish a tough reputation that makes anyone think twice before touching your property. Although the herding economy has become much less important in the South and West, the legacy of its culture of honor remains. These regions have rates of honor-related homicides that are 5 times higher than in other regions of the country. Dov Cohen and Richard Nisbet 15 conducted a series of experiments at the University of Michigan, showing that norms characteristic of the culture of honor show up in the cognitions, emotions, behaviors, and physiological reactions of contemporary Southern white male students, young men whose families have not herded cattle for many generations. In one of their experiments, each participant was directed down a hallway where a male Confederate accidentally bumped into him while passing by and insulted him by muttering a common vulgarity. Compared with Northern white males, Southerners were more likely to react aggressively. Their blood cortisol and testosterone spiked, they reported feeling their masculinity challenged, and ultimately, they were more likely to retaliate aggressively against the Confederate whom they felt had insulted them. Research on cultures of honor has found its effects in many varied domains. In one field experiment, Cohen and Nisbet 16 sent job application letters to companies across the United States, allegedly from people who had killed someone in an honor-related dispute. Companies located in the South and West were far more likely to respond in a receptive and understanding manner than those located in the North. High school students in culture of honor states are far more likely than students from other states to bring a weapon to school and to use that weapon, and these states have more than twice as many school shootings per capita as do other states. 17 Men in cultures of honor around the world tend to distrust government and believe they are the ones who have the obligation to retaliate to a provocation, personally and sometimes violently. Cultures of honor also have higher rates of domestic violence. Both sexes in such cultures believe it is appropriate for a man to physically assault a woman if he believes she is threatening his honor and reputation by being unfaithful or by leaving him. 18. As these findings show, we can see that although a physiological component of aggression is present in human beings and other primates, aggression is not a reflexive instinct. Cultural influences get under our skin, literally, to shape our responses to situational and social events, and thereby determine whether we will respond aggressively. That means that if certain situational and social conditions can predictably increase aggressive behavior, other conditions can reduce them. Gender and aggression. The research on cultures of honor suggests that male aggression is encouraged when it fulfills a central part of the male role and identity. When being a man is defined by competitiveness and strength, men are constantly trying to prove their masculinity and status in displays of aggression. 19 Conversely, when men live in cultures that lack internal and external threats to their survival, and admittedly, not many cultures are so blessed, they are not raised to be aggressive, sex differences are minimized, and cooperation is encouraged. 20. Nevertheless, the number one predictor of violence is gender. As adults, men are more likely than women to get into spontaneous, unprovoked acts of picking a fight with a stranger, join in a mob bent on destruction and looting, and commit violent crimes such as assault, rape, and murder. 21 Starting in childhood, boys are consistently more likely than girls to engage in rough and tumble play, along with non-playful pushing, shoving, and hitting. And in cross-cultural study by Dane Archer and Patricia McDaniel, 22 teenagers from 11 countries read stories involving interpersonal conflict and then were asked to compose their own endings. In every country, young men showed a greater tendency to end the story with violence. It is commonly believed that the hormone that fuels male aggression is testosterone, which both sexes have, although in higher proportion in males. Laboratory animals whose testosterone is removed become less aggressive, and those injected with testosterone become more aggressive. James Dabbs and his colleagues 23 found that naturally occurring testosterone levels are significantly higher among prisoners convicted of violent crimes than among those convicted of non-violent crimes, and among college students, men in fraternities who were considered cruder, more rambunctious, and less socially responsible by others were found to have the highest average testosterone levels. 24 Testosterone affects many of the behaviors we stereotypically associate with young males: aggressiveness, competition, and risk-taking. However, the reverse is also true. Aggressive or competitive behavior increases the release of testosterone, presumably to prepare the animal to behave aggressively. 25. But all of these findings are correlational, not explanatory. And as we just saw, northern young men have the same testosterone that southern young men have, but they are not as roused to respond aggressively to perceived insults. The biologist and zoologist Robert Sapolsky, in his book Behave, The Biology of Humans at Our Best and Worst, summarized the matter this way: by looking at the correlational studies, we would conclude that testosterone causes aggression. Time to see how wrong that is. 26. Why? Even when testosterone is completely eliminated in males, aggression continues to occur. Moreover, the more experience a male had being aggressive prior to castration, the more aggression continues afterward. Furthermore, Sapolsky adds, if testosterone is a strong predictor of violence, we would expect that differences in testosterone levels should predict which animals within a species, birds, fish, mammals, primates, will behave aggressively. They do not. Physical aggression: if women aren't very likely to get into fistfights, start riots, or shoot someone to defend their family's reputation, does that mean that they are inherently less aggressive than men? Gender differences are obvious in the larger social world, in the private world of families and relationships. Gender differences aren't always so clear. Most cases of extreme violence in the family are perpetrated by men. For example, 8 in 10 murderers who kill a family member are male. And when men beat up their victims, they usually inflict more serious injury than women abusers do. 27. However, when it comes to forms of physical aggression that are less violent than murder and brutal beatings, there is often great overlap between males and females, and contrary to gender stereotypes, in many relationships both sides are equally aggressive. For example, in a study of nearly 500 first-year American college women who reported their experiences of violence with their boyfriends, most reported that the abuse was reciprocal. 28. A review of more than 200 studies of community samples found no significant gender differences in the percentage of men and women who were physically aggressive with their partners. 29. And they behaved that way for the same reasons: jealousy, anger, revenge, and self-defense. 30. In some studies that compared young boys and girls in levels of physical aggression, most of the boys and girls were actually alike in being unaggressive. The sex difference was due primarily to a small number of extremely aggressive boys. 31. Among adults, the sex difference in the willingness to inflict physical harm often vanishes when both sexes feel provoked and entitled to retaliate. One meta-analysis of 64 separate experiments found that although men are more aggressive than women under ordinary circumstances, the gender difference shrinks when men and women are insulted and when women are given the same chance to retaliate aggressively, especially when others are unaware of their gender. 32. Just as male aggression is influenced by culture, so is female aggression. The rate of the physical abuse of women, through beatings, stabbings, and hitting, is highest in cultures that regard such abuse as a male prerogative and a legitimate means of asserting power and control over women, as we see in countries where girls can be murdered just for wanting to attend school. 33 Yet in one international study, women from Australia and New Zealand showed greater evidence of aggressiveness than men from Sweden and Korea. 34 In a cultural community that admires physical aggression, both sexes may rely on violent tactics. Female teenage members of Mexican-American gangs in Los Angeles carry any kind of weapon they can get hold of, from bats to guns, and told a researcher that they had joined not only for social support but for revenge. 35 A study of all known female suicide bombers throughout the world since 1981 found that the main motives and circumstances that drive female suicide bombers are quite similar to those that drive men: loyalty to their country or religion, anger at being occupied by a foreign military, and revenge for loved ones killed by the enemy. 36 Relational aggression. Recall that I defined aggression as the intention to harm another person, and harm does not always mean through physical confrontation. Females are more prone than men to engage in a more social form of aggression, which Nikki Crick and her associates call relational aggression. 37 Or hurting others by sabotaging their reputations and relationships. Shunning, spreading false rumors and malicious gossip, backbiting, and slut-shaming are prime examples, and the consequences can be devastating. 38 The average gender difference in relational aggression starts early. In one study of 3 to 5-year-old children playing in groups of 3, the kids were instructed to use a crayon to color in a picture on a white sheet of paper. 3 crayons were provided, but only one was a color and the other 2 were white. Naturally, the children all wanted the orange crayon. The boys used physical aggression to get it, hitting or pushing the child who had the orange crayon. The girls used relational aggression, spreading rumors about the child with the orange crayon or ignoring her to make her cry. 39 Relational aggression. A more social, non-physical form of aggression aimed at hurting others, by sabotaging reputations and relationships with peers, exemplified by spreading false rumors and malicious gossip. One especially harmful form of relational aggression is online bullying. With the advent of the internet, bullies are no longer limited to the school environment. Victims can be bullied and harassed around the clock, 7 days a week. The internet has given the relational bully a megaphone. A person's reputation can be attacked widely with the click of a mouse, undetected by teachers and parents. 40 Cyberbullying may be a one-time impulsive act or a planned campaign of harassment. Phoebe Prince, a 15-year-old Irish girl living in Massachusetts, was targeted by a group known as the Mean Girls in a dispute over her brief relationship with a popular boy at her school. 4 girls and 2 boys began a relentless campaign against her of verbal assault and threats of bodily harm. After 4 months of being slandered and harassed, Prince hanged herself at home. According to a review prepared for the government on child safety and online technologies, the greatest source of danger that teenagers face on the internet does not come from pornography or even from predatory adults, let alone from sexting. The report found that the most frequent threats that minors face, both online and offline, are forms of relational aggression by their peers. 41 Catharsis, does it work? Let's turn now to the widespread belief that some kinds of aggressive acts can serve a useful and perhaps a necessary function: they let off steam. That belief stems from the psychoanalytic concept of catharsis, or the release of energy. Sigmund Freud believed that aggressive energy must come out somehow, lest it continue to build up and produce illness. His theory rested on the analogy of water pressure building up in a container. Unless aggression is allowed to drain off, it will produce an explosion. According to Freud, society performs an essential function in regulating the death instinct, and in helping people to sublimate it, that is, to turn the destructive energy into acceptable or useful activities. 42 The most acceptable forms of sublimation were generally thought to be art and sports. The psychiatrist William Menninger 43 asserted that competitive games provide an unusually satisfactory outlet for the instinctive aggressive drive. Catharsis. Specifically, the release of energy, Freud believed that unless people were allowed to express aggressive behavior, the aggressive energy would be dammed up, the pressure would build up, and the energy thus produced would seek an outlet, resulting in violence or a symptom of mental illness. The belief in the emotional and physical benefits of catharsis has become part of our cultural mythology. In the movie Analyze This, a psychiatrist is forced into a therapeutic relationship with a mafia boss and murderer played by Robert De Niro. The De Niro character is suffering from hypertension, allegedly brought on by excessive anger and anxiety. During one of their therapy sessions, the Billy Crystal character says, "You know what I do when I'm angry? I hit a pillow. Try that." For a mobster, of course, hit means kill. So De Niro promptly whips out his gun and fires several bullets into a pillow. Billy Crystal gulps, forces a smile, and says, "Feel better?" "Yeah, I do," says De Niro. Charming? Yes. Accurate? Nope. Abundant evidence indicates that the Billy Crystal solution simply does not work. In one experiment, Brad Bushman 44 made his participants angry by having his accomplice insult them. Immediately afterward, the participants were assigned to one of 3 experimental conditions. In one condition, they were allowed to spend a few minutes slugging away at a punching bag, while being encouraged to think about the student who had made them angry. In a second condition, the students hitting the punching bag were encouraged to think of this activity as physical exercise. In the third condition, the participants simply were allowed to sit still for a few minutes without punching anything. At the end of the experiment, which students felt the least angry? Those participants who simply sat still without punching anything. Bushman next gave the participants a chance to aggress against the person who had insulted them by blasting him with a loud, unpleasant noise. The students who had hit the punching bag while thinking about their enemy were the most aggressive, blasting him the loudest and the longest. Those who had just sat still after the insult were the least aggressive. Bushman's laboratory experiment is supported by a field study of high school football players. Arthur Patterson 45 measured the general hostility of these football players, rating them before, during, and after the football season. If the intense physical activity and aggressive behavior that are part of playing football reduce the tension caused by pent-up aggression, we would expect the players to exhibit a decline in hostility over the course of the season. Instead, there was a significant increase in hostility among the players as the football season wore on. What happens when acts of aggression are targeted directly against the person who provoked us? Does this satiate our need to aggress and therefore reduce our tendency to hurt that person further? Again, systematic research demonstrates that, as in the punching bag experiment, exactly the opposite occurs. In an experiment by Russell Geen and his associates 46, each participant was paired with another student, who was a confederate of the experimenters. First, the confederate angered the participant. During this phase of the experiment, which involved the exchanging of opinions on various issues, the participant was given electric shocks when his partner disagreed with his opinion. Next, during a study of the effects of punishment on learning, the participant acted as a teacher while the confederate served as learner. On the first learning task, some of the participants were required to shock the confederate each time he made a mistake, other participants merely recorded his errors. On the next task, all the participants were given the opportunity to deliver shocks to the confederate. What happened? Contrary to the catharsis hypothesis, people who had previously shocked the confederate delivered more frequent and more intense shocks the second time around. The same kind of behavior has also been observed systematically in naturally occurring events in the real world, where verbal acts of aggression serve to facilitate further attacks. In one natural experiment, a number of technicians working for a company were laid off, and thus understandably angry at their employers. Several were then provided with a chance to verbalize their hostility against their ex-bosses. Later, all of the technicians were asked to describe their bosses. Those who previously had been allowed to vent their feelings were much nastier in their subsequent descriptions than those who had not. 47. The message is clear: physical activity, like punching a punching bag or playing an aggressive sport, neither dissipates anger nor reduces subsequent aggression against the person who provoked it. In fact, the data lead us in precisely the opposite direction. The more that people ventilate anger by behaving aggressively, the angrier they remain and the more aggressive they become. Venting anger, directly or indirectly, verbally or physically, does not reduce hostility, it increases it. Interestingly, similar experiments 48 find that people who believe in catharsis are more likely to aggress as a way of trying to feel better. But it just makes them angrier and more likely to yell and kick. Apparently, the more you believe that aggression will make you feel better, the more aggressively you will act out, and the less peaceful it will make you. Retaliation, overkill, and escalation. Why does expressing anger aggressively lead to greater hostility? Once we express negative feelings toward another person, once we label our ex-boss a heartless jerk, it becomes that much easier to follow up with consistent statements and actions, particularly if we have retaliated in public. Moreover, retaliation is typically more severe than the initial insult or attack. We tend to engage in overkill, which sets the stage for dissonance reduction. An experiment by Michael Kahn 49 showed how overkill operates, to our detriment. In Kahn's experiment, a medical technician, while taking physiological indicators from college students, made derogatory remarks about these students. In one condition, the students were allowed to vent their hostility by expressing their feelings about the technician to his employer, an action that they knew would get the technician into serious trouble, probably costing him his job. In another condition, they were not provided with the opportunity to express any aggression against him. Those given the opportunity to get the technician in trouble subsequently disliked him more and expressed greater hostility toward him than did those not given the opportunity to vent. Overkill maximizes dissonance. The greater the discrepancy between what the perpetrator did to you and your retaliation, the greater the dissonance. The greater the dissonance, the greater your need to denigrate him and justify your treatment of him. 50. Recall the incident I described in Chapter 3, of 4 students who were shot and killed by the Ohio National Guard during an anti-war protest. Whatever those students might have been doing, it hardly merited being shot and killed. Yet after they were killed, the guards and local townspeople described them in extremely hostile terms. If I have shot a student who was merely dissenting, or if I am a person who believes in law and order and support my local police, then I will try to convince myself they really deserved it, and I will hate the dissenting students even more than I did before they were shot. This method of reducing dissonance in the face of an injustice or crime is universal. How do you think members of anti-American terrorist groups and their sympathizers felt about Americans after the slaughter of September 11th? Do you think they felt sorrow and compassion for the thousands of innocent victims, rescue workers, and their families? Do you think they decided that Americans had suffered enough? In most situations, committing or condoning violence does not reduce the tendency toward violence. Committing acts of violence increases our negative feelings about the victims. Ultimately, this is why violence almost always breeds more violence. But what would happen if we could somehow arrange it so that retaliation is not allowed to run roughshod over the instigator of aggression? That is, what if the degree of retaliation is reasonably controlled so that it is not significantly more intense than the action that precipitated it? In such a circumstance, I would predict that there would be little or no dissonance. Sam has insulted me, I've paid him back exactly in kind, we are even. Experiments confirm that when the retaliation matches the provocation, people do not denigrate or belittle the provocateur. 51. There is a major point here that must be emphasized. Most situations in the real world are far messier than this. Retaliation almost always exceeds the original offense. Experimental research tells us why. The pain we receive always feels more intense than the pain we inflict. The old joke of the other guy's broken leg is trivial. "Our broken fingernail is serious," turns out to be an accurate description of our neurological wiring. A team of English neurologists 52 paired people in a tit-for-tat experiment. Each pair was hooked up to a mechanism that exerted pressure on their index fingers, and each participant was instructed to apply the same force on their partner's finger that they had just felt. The researchers found that the participants were unable to retaliate exactly in kind, although they tried very hard to do so. Every time one partner felt the pressure, he retaliated with considerably greater force, thinking he was responding with the same force as he had received. In this way, the game that began with an exchange of soft touches quickly escalated into severe and painful pressure. The researchers concluded that the escalation of pain is a natural byproduct of neural processing. It helps explain why two boys who start out exchanging punches on the arm as a game soon find themselves in a furious fistfight, and why conflicts between nations frequently escalate. Each side justifies what they do as merely evening the score. Causes of aggression. Just as pain escalates retaliation of more pain, one major cause of violence, in addition to obvious causes like intergroup hatred, revenge, or war, is violence itself. When a person commits an act of aggression, especially with a force that exceeds what the victim may have done to elicit it, this sets up cognitive and motivational forces aimed at justifying that aggression, which open the door to more of it. Let us look at some of the other major causes of aggression. Alcohol. One drug that many people throughout the world happily ingest is alcohol. Alcohol tends to lower our inhibitions, making drinkers friendlier and more gregarious, but also loosening the restrictions on committing aggressive acts, including sexual assault. 53 fistfights frequently break out in bars and nightclubs, and family violence is often associated with the abuse of alcohol, though it is also the case that some spouses drink in order to have an excuse to verbally or physically abuse one another. 54 In addition, controlled laboratory experiments demonstrate that when people drink enough alcohol to make them legally drunk, they tend to respond more violently to provocations than those who have ingested little or no alcohol. 55. This does not mean that alcohol automatically increases aggression. People who have been drinking are not necessarily driven to go around picking fights. Rather, alcohol serves as a disinhibitor. It reduces social inhibitions, making us less cautious and more impulsive. But it does more than that. Alcohol also tends to disrupt the way we usually process information. 56 Intoxicated people often focus upon and respond to the earliest and most obvious aspects of a social situation and tend to miss the subtleties. That means, in practical terms, that if you are sober and someone accidentally steps on your toe, chances are you would know the person didn't do it on purpose. But if you were drunk, you might miss the subtle cues and respond as if he stomped on your foot with full intent. Accordingly, you might retaliate with an insult, shove, or punch. This is precisely the kind of ambiguous situation that males might interpret as provocative if they are not thinking clearly, and alcohol impairs clear thinking. Alcohol is one of the primary reasons for the pervasive miscommunications between women and men in claims of sexual assault, because alcohol significantly impairs the cognitive interpretation of the other person's behavior, sexual negotiations, and memory. As Deborah Davis and Elizabeth Loftus have found, men who are drunk are less likely to interpret non-consent messages accurately, and women who are drunk convey less emphatic signs of refusal. 57. There is another way in which alcohol facilitates aggression, however, and this is through what has been called the think-drink effect. When people expect alcohol to have certain effects on them, it often does. Indeed, when people expect that alcohol will release their aggressive impulses, they often do become more aggressive, even when they are drinking something non-alcoholic. In a study of 116 men ages 18 to 45, experimenters gave 1/3 of the men a non-alcoholic drink, 1/3 a drink targeting a modest blood alcohol level, and 1/3 a stronger drink targeting a high blood alcohol level. Within each of these three groups, the researchers manipulated the drinkers' expectancies of how much alcohol they were getting. They then measured the men's behavior toward a research confederate who had insulted them. Remarkably, the actual quantity of alcohol that the men drank was related less to their aggressive behavior than their expectations were. The more alcohol the men believed they were drinking, the more aggressively they behaved toward the Confederate. 58. Of course, alcohol does have potent physiological effects on cognition and behavior. But those effects interact with what people have learned about alcohol, such as whether it provides an excuse to behave aggressively or sexually and how they expect to feel after imbibing. Pain, discomfort, and hunger. If an animal experiences pain and cannot flee the scene, it will almost invariably attack. This is true of rats, mice, hamsters, foxes, monkeys, crayfish, snakes, raccoons, alligators, and a host of other animals. 59. They will attack members of their own species, members of different species, or anything else in sight, including stuffed dolls and tennis balls. Do you think this is true of human beings, as well? A moment's reflection might help you guess that it may well be. Most of us become irritable when we have been subjected to a sharp, unexpected pain and hence are prone to lash out at the nearest available target. In a series of experiments, Leonard Berkowitz 60 showed that students who underwent the pain of having their hand immersed in excruciatingly cold water showed a sharp increase in committing aggressive acts against other students. It follows that other forms of bodily discomfort, such as heat, humidity, air pollution, and offensive odors, increase anger and thereby lower the threshold for aggressive behavior. 61. One potent form of discomfort is hunger, which is accompanied by low blood glucose. Brad Bushman and his colleagues recruited 107 married couples for a study. 62. He began by assessing the quality of their relationships and taught them how to measure their blood sugar. Then he sent each volunteer home with a voodoo doll and 51 pins, telling them that the doll represented their spouse. Every night they were to stab the doll with pins that reflected how angry they were with their spouse that day. The more pins, the angrier. After 3 weeks, Bushman and his team assessed the damage done to each doll. Spouses who had the lowest blood sugar levels had stuck more than twice as many pins in the voodoo dolls, compared with people with the highest levels. Did those angry feelings translate into aggressive behavior? In the next experiment, the researchers had the couples play a computer game in which the winner got to blast his or her spouse with a mixture of awful noises that most people hate, like fingernails scratching on chalkboards, dentist drills, and sirens. Once again, the lower a person's blood sugar, the more likely he or she was to blast a spouse. As Bushman put it, the husbands hurt their wives because they were feeling the toxic combination of anger and hunger. They were hangry. Heat and global warming. Given the fact that our planet is heating up, what might that change foretell in terms of aggression? In 1967, when the country was divided over the war in Vietnam and racial injustice, national leaders worried that riots and other forms of civic unrest would occur with greater frequency in the heat of summer than in the fall, winter, or spring. And in fact, during what came to be called the long, hot summer of 1967, 159 race riots erupted across the nation. Was heat a contributing factor? As it happens, yes. In a systematic analysis of disturbances occurring in 79 cities between 1967 and 1971, Merrill Carl Smith and Craig Anderson 63 found that riots were far more likely to occur during hot days than during cold days. In subsequent studies, Anderson and his colleagues 64 have shown that, the hotter it is on a given day, the greater the likelihood that people will commit violent crimes. Moreover, heat did not increase the incidence of burglary and other property crimes, thus strengthening the linkage between heat and aggression. But, as you know by now, we have to be cautious about interpreting events that take place in natural settings. The scientist in you might be tempted to ask whether increases in aggression are due to the temperature itself or merely to the fact that more people are apt to be outside on hot days than on cool or rainy days. So how might we determine that it's the heat itself that caused the aggression and not merely the greater opportunity for contact? We can bring the phenomenon into the laboratory, which turns out to be remarkably easy to do. In one such experiment, William Griffith and Roberta Veitch 65 simply administered a test to students, some of whom took it in a room with normal temperature and some of whom took it in a room where the temperature was allowed to soar to 90 degrees Fahrenheit. The students in the hot room not only reported feeling more aggressive but also expressed more hostility to a stranger whom they were asked to describe and rate. Additional evidence from the natural world helps bolster our belief that heat is the culprit. In Major League Baseball games, significantly more batters are hit by pitched balls when the temperature is above 90 degrees than when it is below 90 degrees. 66 And in the desert city of Phoenix, Arizona, drivers without air-conditioned cars are more likely to honk their horns in traffic jams than are drivers with air-conditioned cars. 67. If heat increases hostility, global warming should have an effect on aggression as well. An analysis of 60 studies from archaeology, psychology, and other disciplines, with data going back to 10,000 BCE and covering all world regions, found that warmer temperatures substantially increase the risk of many types of conflict, from domestic violence, murder, and rape to riots and civil wars. 68. Rejection, exclusion, and taunting. As I noted in Chapter 2, social pain registers in our brains in much the same way as physical pain, and it, too, produces aggression. In 1999, at Columbine High School in Littleton, Colorado, 2 students, armed to the teeth and very angry, went on a rampage, killing a teacher and 14 students. This was the most dramatic and most devastating of 11 such incidents that took place in schools in less than 3 years, and which occur with regularity, in part because they are covered by the media and thus inspire copycats. 69 What drove the Columbine killers over the edge? Although it was later learned that Harris was most likely a psychopath, there is more to the story. After an intensive study of the situation, I am convinced that rampage killings are just the pathological tip of an enormous iceberg, the poisonous social atmosphere prevalent at many high schools in this country, an atmosphere fraught with exclusion, rejection, taunting, and humiliation. 70 In high school, there is an ironclad hierarchy of cliques with athletes, class officers, cheerleaders, and cool kids at the top. At the bottom are kids who those at the top refer to as nerds, goths, geeks, loners, homos, kids who are too fat, too thin, too short, too tall, wear the wrong clothes, or whatever. The teenagers near the top of the hierarchy are constantly rejecting, taunting, and ridiculing those below them. Mark Leary and his associates 71 conducted a systematic analysis of over 15 school shootings that occurred during a 5-year period and found that acute or chronic rejection, ostracism, bullying, or romantic rejection, was present in all but 2 of the incidents. The other factors were a fascination with guns, explosives, and Satanism, as well as psychological problems like depression and poor impulse control. Research by Jean Twenge, Roy Baumeister, and others 72 demonstrates that being rejected has a plethora of negative effects, not the least of which is a dramatic increase in aggressiveness. In one experiment, college students met in a group and became acquainted. They were then asked to indicate which of their fellow students they would want to collaborate with in the future. A random sample of the participants received information that nobody wanted to work with them. When subsequently provided with an opportunity to aggress, the rejects expressed far more intense hostility than those who had not been excluded. In another experiment, people rejected during a game of cyberball were more likely to blast their rejector with loud noise than those who had been included, and excluded participants were especially aggressive if they had measured low in impulse control. Rampage shooters often make their sense of rejection abundantly clear. In a video that Harris and Klebold recorded just prior to their murder spree, they specifically railed against the in-group who had rejected and humiliated them. This was confirmed by a student in the Columbine in-group, who, when interviewed a few weeks after the tragedy, justified his own exclusionary behavior by saying this. Most kids didn't want them there. They were into witchcraft. They were into voodoo. Sure, we teased them. But what do you expect with kids who come to school with weird hairdos and horns on their hats? If you want to get rid of someone, usually you tease them. So the whole school would call them homos. 73. Likewise, before Elliot Rodger killed 6 people and wounded 23 others in Santa Barbara, he wrote a manifesto describing his many complaints. He was bullied in the 10th grade, he wrote, and added, "I was completely and utterly alone. No one knew me or extended a hand to help me. I was an innocent, scared little boy trapped in a jungle full of malicious predators, and I was shown no mercy. Some boys randomly pushed me against the lockers as they walked past me in the hall. One boy who was tall and had blonde hair called me a loser, right in front of his girlfriends. I developed extreme feelings of envy, hatred, and anger towards anyone who has a sex life. I saw them as the enemy. I felt condemned to live a life of lonely celibacy while other boys were allowed to experience the pleasures of sex, all because girls didn't want me. I felt inferior and undesirable. This time, however, I couldn't just stand by and accept such an injustice anymore. Of course, not all students who are rejected and taunted go on a murderous rampage. The behavior of shooters like these is pathological in the extreme, but certainly not unfathomable. My best guess is that there are hundreds of thousands of students undergoing similarly stressful experiences. They may suffer in silence, but they do suffer. In the weeks following the Columbine massacre, internet chat rooms were flooded with postings from unhappy teenagers. Although they did not condone the behavior of the shooters, the overwhelming majority said they understood it, expressing their own hurt and anger about having been rejected and taunted. They posted remarks that can best be summarized as, "Of course, I would never shoot anybody, but I sure have had fantasies about doing it." That kind of statement should make us sit up and take notice. Is there anything we can do to change the social atmosphere in our schools? Yes. I will discuss some tried and true interventions near the end of this chapter, as well as in the following chapter. Frustration, deprivation, and aggression of all the unpleasant conditions that provoke aggression, anger, pain, excessive heat, hunger, and rejection. The major instigator of aggression is frustration. Imagine the following situation: you must drive across town for an important job interview. On your way to the parking lot, you realize you are a bit late for your appointment, so you break into a fast trot. When you find your car, you notice, to your dismay, that you have a flat tire. "Okay, I'll be 20 minutes late, that's not too bad," you say as you take the jack and lug wrench out of the trunk. After much tugging and hauling, you remove the old tire, put on the spare tire, tighten the lugs, and lo and behold, the spare tire also is flat. Seething with frustration, you trudge back to your dorm and enter your room. Your roommate sees you standing there, resume in hand, sweaty, dirty, and rumpled. Immediately sizing up the situation, he asks humorously, "How did the interview go?" Should he be prepared to duck? If an individual is thwarted on the way to a goal, the resulting frustration will increase the probability of an aggressive response. A demonstration of this frustration-aggression relationship comes from a classic experiment by Roger Barker, Tamara Dembo, and Kurt Lewin. 74 These psychologists frustrated young children by showing them a roomful of appealing toys, which were then kept out of reach. The children stood outside a wire screen, looking at the toys, hoping to play with them, even expecting to play with them, but were unable to reach them. After a painfully long wait, the children were finally allowed to play with the toys. In this experiment, a separate group of children was allowed to play with the toys directly without first being frustrated. This second group of children played joyfully with the toys. But the frustrated group, when finally given access to the toys, was extremely destructive. Many of them smashed the toys, threw them against the wall, and stepped on them. Talk about frustration leading to aggression. Frustration, aggression. When a person is thwarted on the way to a goal, the frustration will increase the probability of an aggressive response. Several factors can accentuate angry responses to frustration. Suppose you were about to bite into a Big Mac and somebody snatched it away. This would be more likely to frustrate you, and lead to an aggressive response, than if someone had stopped you if you were merely on your way to McDonald's to buy a Big Mac. An analog of this situation was demonstrated in a field study by Mary Harris. 75 She had students cut in front of people waiting in line for tickets, outside of restaurants, or in a supermarket checkout line. Sometimes they cut in front of the second person in line, other times in front of the 12th person. The people standing behind the intruder became much more aggressive when the student cut into the second place in line. Frustration tends to be high when a goal is just within reach and in view when you are blocked from it. When the interruption is unexpected or when it seems illegitimate, the frustration is increased still further, as an experiment by James Kulik and Roger Brown 76 demonstrated. Participants were told they could earn money by telephoning for donations to charity and obtaining pledges. Some of the callers were led to expect a high rate of contributions, being informed that previous calls had been successful almost 2/3 of the time. Others were led to expect far less success. When the potential donor refused to contribute, as all of them did, the callers with the high expectations spoke more harshly and hung up the telephone with more force. The experimenters also varied the reasons the Confederates gave for refusing to contribute, sometimes making them sound legitimate and sometimes having them sound arbitrary and illegitimate. The people who heard refusals that seemed unjustified became more aggressive. The frustrating experience of perceived unfairness also can provoke aggression, an effect so fundamental it has been demonstrated with monkeys. Sarah Brosnan and Franz de Waal 77 rewarded Capuchin monkeys with cucumber slices in exchange for a token. Monkeys love cucumbers, so this was a happy transaction. But if a nearby monkey received a grape for his token, the first monkey would get angry. The cucumber, in light of the grape transaction, was now an insulting offer. Some offended monkeys threw the cucumber at the experimenter in rage. In some, frustration is most pronounced when the goal is within reach, when expectations are high, when the rule of fairness has been violated, and when the goal is blocked without a compelling reason. These factors help draw the important distinction between frustration and deprivation. Children who don't have toys do not necessarily become angry or aggressive. Rather, as the toy experiment indicates, it was those children who had every reason to expect to play with the toys who felt frustrated when that expectancy was thwarted. This thwarted hope was what caused the children to behave destructively. Experiments like these and sociological studies at a national level have led to the discovery that frustration is often not the result of simple deprivation. It is the result of relative deprivation, the deprivation we feel when we see others enjoying a better situation or when we are deprived of something relative to our expectations. If you ever fly coach, you probably know what I'm talking about. After waiting in line at security, and then waiting for other passengers to board at the gate, you now must pass through the first-class cabin to get to your seat. As you are beginning to doubt that you'll find overhead space for your carry-on bag, let alone space for your legs in ever smaller seats, you are treated to the sight of first-class passengers relaxing in relative splendor, enjoying champagne and roasted nuts, and being waited on by a flight attendant who seems genuinely happy to have them on board. How do you feel? Relative deprivation. The feeling that occurs when people notice that other people have more or are doing better than they are, and that the system is treating them unfairly relative to what people around them have. According to studies of air rage, the hostile and abusive behavior demonstrated by airline passengers, you're not feeling so good, you'd be much happier if there were no first-class section on the plane. Catherine Dessels and Michael Norton 78 collected a complete set of all onboard air rage incidents over several years from a large international airline and found that the presence of a first-class cabin produced 4 times as many aggressive incidents among passengers in economy. Especially when economy passengers had to board from the front and walk through the first-class cabin. When airline service is one class for everyone, there is no relative deprivation, it's absolute. Somehow, I doubt that airlines will take advantage of this important finding. Where huge corporations are involved, short-term profit almost always trumps customer satisfaction. Relative deprivation explains a persistent mystery about most social revolutions. They usually are not started by people whose faces are in the mud. They are most frequently started by people who have recently lifted their faces out of the mud, looked around, and noticed that other people are doing better than they are and that the system is treating them unfairly. Countries with the widest gaps in income have higher rates of homicide and other indicators of aggression, if citizens believe that income inequality is unfair. 79 In the 1960s, the most intense riots by African Americans did not take place in the geographical areas of greatest poverty. They took place in Los Angeles and Detroit, where things were not nearly as bad for blacks, economically and socially, as they were in many other sections of the country. But they were bad relative to black people's perceptions, in those communities, of what white people had. As Alexis de Tocqueville wrote more than 150 years ago, evils which are patiently endured when they seem inevitable, become intolerable once the idea of escape from them is suggested. 80. As long as people live with hopes that are unsatisfied, they will feel frustrations that can result in aggression. Aggression can be reduced by satisfying their hope, or by trying to extinguish it. Hopeless people are apathetic people. Ugandans, when they were living under the tyrannical, repressive, and wantonly violent dictatorship of Idi Amin, dared not dream of improving conditions or rebelling against Amin's rule. In the former Soviet Union, serious rebellion took place only after 1991, when the government had loosened the chains controlling the population. In South Africa, blacks did not revolt against apartheid as long as they were prevented from hoping for anything better. Clearly, eliminating people's hopes for better, fairer lives is an undesirable means of reducing aggression. The saving grace of our nation is that, theoretically, at least, this is a land of promise. We teach our children, explicitly and implicitly, to hope, to expect, and to work to improve their lives. But unless this hope stands a reasonable chance of being fulfilled, turmoil will be inevitable and peace elusive. Demagogues who cynically raise a population's hopes, without first having explored the means of fulfilling them, are sowing the seeds of revolution. Social learning and aggression. I turn now to some findings from social cognitive learning theory, which holds that people learn how to behave, including aggressively or helpfully, through cognitive processes such as their beliefs and perceptions of events and through observation and imitation of others. Social cognitive learning theory. The theory that people learn how to behave through their cognitive processes, such as their perceptions of events and through observation and imitation of others. I noted that pain, hunger, heat, and frustration often provoke aggression, but social cognitive learning theory reminds us that in between the provocation and the reaction lies the human brain, our ability to take the intentions of others into account. Consider the following situations. A considerate person accidentally steps on your toe. A thoughtless person, whom you know doesn't care about you, steps on your toe. Let us assume the amount of pressure and pain is exactly the same in both cases. My guess is that the latter situation would evoke an aggressive response, but the former would produce little or no aggression. To demonstrate the effect of intervening perceptions on behavior, Shahbaz Malik and Boyd McCandless 81 frustrated third-grade children by arranging things so that another child's clumsiness prevented them from achieving a goal that would have resulted in a cash prize. Some of these children were subsequently provided with a reasonable explanation for the behavior of the child who fouled them up. They were told he had been sleepy and upset. The children in this condition directed much less aggression against the thwarting child than did children who were not given this explanation. Moreover, later research 82 using adults indicates that we are less apt to retaliate against someone who has provoked our anger when we hear a good excuse for their actions before they occur rather than after the fact. And if we know someone's history, we are less likely to blame them and be angered by their missteps. 83. But just as these explanations can reduce aggression in a person who is frustrated, the presence of aggressive stimuli can increase aggression. Leonard Berkowitz and his colleagues have shown that, if an individual is angered or frustrated, the mere mention of a word or name associated with the provocation will increase that person's level of aggression. In one experiment, 84 participants were paired with another student who was introduced either as a college boxer or as a speech major. This accomplice angered the participants by shocking them. Then half of them viewed a violent prize-fighting scene from a movie while the others watched an exciting but non-aggressive film clip. When subsequently given the chance to shock the confederate, those who had seen the violent movie segment administered more and longer shocks. Moreover, those paired with the boxer delivered more shocks to that target than those paired with the speech major. The very word boxer served as an aggressive stimulus. As with words, so it is with objects. The mere presence of an object associated with aggression, a gun, rifle, or other weapon, can serve as a cue for an aggressive response. In a classic experiment of this weapon's effect, 85 college students were insulted in a room in which a rifle was left lying around and others in a room in which a neutral object was substituted for the rifle. The students were then given the opportunity to administer electric shocks to a fellow student. Those who had been made angry in the presence of the rifle, the aggressive stimulus, administered more electric shocks than did those made angry in the presence of the badminton racket. 86. Weapons effect. When the mere presence of an object associated with aggression, gun, rifle, or other weapon, serves as a cue for an aggressive response. Experiments find that people drive more aggressively if randomly assigned to a condition where a gun is on the passenger seat. 87 Evidence that contradicts the slogan often seen on bumper stickers, "Guns don't kill people, people do." As Berkowitz put it, the finger pulls the trigger, but the trigger may also be pulling the finger. Perhaps the rates of violence in America are so high because we are the most heavily armed society in the world, with more guns than citizens. 88 This means that we have not only the means for killing, but also a constant stream of cues provoking aggressive thoughts. Those cues associated with aggression unconsciously add fuel to the fire. One aspect of social learning that tends to inhibit aggression is the tendency most people have to take responsibility for their actions. But what happens if this sense of responsibility is weakened? Philip Zimbardo 89 has demonstrated that persons who are anonymous, and therefore unidentifiable, tend to act more aggressively than persons who are not anonymous. In Zimbardo's experiment, female students were required to shock another student as part of a study of empathy. Some students were made anonymous. They were seated in a dimly lit room, dressed in loose-fitting robes and large hoods, and never referred to by name. Others were easily identifiable. Their room was brightly lit, they wore no robes or hoods, and each woman wore a name tag. As expected, those students who were anonymous administered longer and more severe shocks. Anonymity induces de-individuation, a state of lessened self-awareness, reduced concern about what other people think of them, and weakened restraints against prohibited forms of behavior. When we are made self-aware, we tend to uphold our own values. When we are anonymous and not self-aware, we tend to act more on impulse. This is why, for example, people eat less popcorn when they are standing in front of a mirror than when they are sitting in a darkened theater. 90. De-individuation. A state of reduced self-awareness, reduced concern over social evaluation, and weakened restraints against prohibited forms of behavior. Because it was part of a controlled laboratory experiment, the kind of aggression displayed by the women in Zimbardo's research pales in comparison with the wild, impulsive acts of violence typically associated with mobs and vigilante justice, but de-individuation applies there, too. Brian Mullen 91 analyzed newspaper reports of 60 lynchings perpetrated between 1899 and 1946, and he found a strong relationship between mob size and violence. The larger the mob, the more heinous the atrocities committed. When people are part of a crowd, they are faceless, less self-aware, and less mindful of prohibitions against destructive actions. They are therefore less likely to take responsibility for their behavior. In Harper Lee's To Kill a Mockingbird, a mob of white men assemble to lynch Tom Robinson, a black man who has been falsely accused of rape. Scout, the 8-year-old daughter of Robinson's attorney Atticus Finch, recognizes one of the men and calls him out by name. In so doing, she individualizes him, making him accountable for his own actions. The mob gradually disbands and goes home. You don't have to be in a mob or gang to be de-individuated, though. You have only to sit at your computer. On the internet, no one needs to know who you are, and the result is all too apparent in the often vicious commentaries that people post. To counter the aggression facilitated by online de-individuation, many websites today are requiring that people sign in through Facebook or by name. De-individuation, however, does not always and inevitably make people more aggressive, it increases their conformity to the group's norms. Happy people dancing on a boardwalk during spring break can be de-individuated, too, and led to behave in ways they might not otherwise do if they were self-aware, like stripping to the bare essentials and dancing on tabletops. 92. The other major component in social cognitive learning theory is the power of imitation. In a series of classic experiments, Albert Bandura and his colleagues 93 set up a basic procedure in which an adult knocked around a plastic, air-filled Bobo doll, while little kids observed and later had the opportunity to play with the Bobo doll themselves. Sometimes the adult accompanied her physical aggression with verbal abuse. Not only did the children imitate the adult's aggression, sometimes hit for hit and kick for kick, they also behaved in other aggressive ways after having watched her. In short, the children did more than copy the adult, her behavior served as an inspiration for them to come up with their own forms of aggression. Why are these experiments considered so important? Who cares what happens to a Bobo doll, anyway? Stay tuned. Violence and the mass media. Most American children are immersed in images of violence through television, movies, video games, pop and rap music, music videos, comics, and the internet. Immersed in it? They are marinated in it. They see an unending parade of murders, rapes, beatings, explosions, and bad guys committing brutal acts, as well as good guys doing brutal things to catch them. Violence in films has more than doubled since 1950, and gun violence in films rated PG-13 has more than tripled since 1985. In fact, PG-13 films now contain as much violence as films rated R.94. Many people, psychologists as well as the general public, are worried about all the mayhem that children and teenagers observe. They figure there must be significant consequences, starting with making guns seem cool and exciting. For them, it is as obvious as the Bobo doll study that children imitate the violence they see on TV and in the movies and are otherwise affected emotionally by it. If, as we saw in Chapter 4, prosocial role models and media stories can increase helpful behavior in the children who observe them, surely the far more common antisocial, violent videos can increase antisocial, violent behavior. 95. For just as many others, though, this is a non-issue. How powerful can media violence be, they ask, if during the same years that gun violence in PG-13 movies tripled, real-world gun violence and overall violent crime by young people decreased to record lows? Besides, they add, media violence consists of cartoon-like stories and images that, everyone knows, are not real. 96. Indeed, that was the reasoning behind the Supreme Court's 2011 decision that video games can be sold to minors no matter how violent the games are, including the popular Mortal Kombat and Grand Theft Auto series. And so the debate rages on. How would you resolve it? Stories in the news would seem to provide a compelling answer. For example, several years ago, a man drove his truck through the window of a crowded cafeteria in Killeen, Texas, emerged from the cab, and began shooting people at random, killing 22. In his pocket, police found a ticket stub to The Fisher King, a film depicting a deranged man firing a shotgun into a crowded bar, killing several people. Or how about the two teenagers in Tennessee who took their guns and went out sniping at passing cars on a freeway, killing one driver, because they wanted to act out their favorite video game, Grand Theft Auto? On the other hand, there is the case of a man who, having seen a movie showing women dancing on screen, became convinced that all women were immoral and deserved to die. He then committed 4 brutal rape murders before he was caught. Ironically, the film that set him off was The 10 Commandments. Anecdotes like these, no matter how interesting they may be, are not sufficient to answer the question of the effects of media violence. It's too easy to cherry-pick your examples to make a case either way. You could select examples of kids who play Grand Theft Auto and then go off to do their homework and take piano lessons. Accordingly, researchers have conducted experimental and field studies to try to untangle this complicated question. Studying media violence. The beauty of the laboratory experiment is that it allows us to determine whether images in the media have any impact at all on the behavior of a random sample of people. Most of the early experimental evidence demonstrated that watching violence does increase the frequency of aggressive behavior, angry emotions, and hostile thoughts. 97 But not every study found this Bobo doll effect. Today, many researchers believe that the strongest effects of media violence occur when children are actively playing violent video games. Games that directly reward violence, for example, by awarding points or moving the player to the next level after a kill, are especially likely to increase feelings of hostility, aggressive thoughts, and aggressive acts. 98 A meta-analysis of 98 studies, with nearly 37,000 participants, found that both violent video games and pro-social video games have direct effects on their players. 99. The lab allows us to demonstrate that something of significance is happening, but experiments cannot begin to capture the effects on a person who plays video games for hours every day and lives on a steady diet of violence for years. To investigate that effect, we need to use longitudinal studies in which children are followed for a year or longer. The researcher has less control over the factors being studied, but it is a better way of determining the effects of what a child is really being exposed to. In addition, unlike most laboratory experiments that must use artificial measures of aggression, longitudinal studies can measure actual behavior. The disadvantage of this method is that people's lives are full of many other factors that can enhance or mitigate the effects of media violence. That is why the results of longitudinal research are complicated. To begin, these studies generally do find that the more violence children watch, the more aggressively they behave later as teenagers and young adults. For example, one study followed 430 elementary-age children in the 3rd to 5th grades over the course of a school year. The investigators measured 3 types of aggression: verbal, relational, and physical, and exposure to violence in television, movies, and video games. They measured both aggressive and pro-social behaviors in the children twice during the year, interviewing the children's peers and teachers as well as observing the children directly. They found that the children's consumption of media violence early in the school year predicted higher rates of all 3 kinds of aggression and less pro-social behavior later in the year. 100. But the greatest challenge involved in trying to interpret the data in most longitudinal or survey studies is teasing apart cause and effect. The usual assumption has been that watching violence makes children and adults more aggressive, but aggressive people are also drawn to watching violence. Moreover, another entirely independent factor may be causing both. Some children are born with a mental or emotional predisposition toward violence, learn it as toddlers from the way they are treated by abusive parents or siblings, or in other ways develop aggressiveness as a personality trait. For these children, the effects of the media pale in comparison to the far more powerful predictors of aggressive behavior, including being socially rejected by peers, being the victim of physical abuse, being in a peer group that endorses and encourages violence, and living in a community where aggression is a way of life. 101 The result manifests itself in the children's aggressive behavior and in their liking for watching violence or playing aggressive games. 102. In an experiment investigating the interaction between temperament and exposure to violence, children watched either a film depicting a great deal of police violence or an exciting but non-violent film about bike racing. They then played a game of floor hockey. Watching the violent film did increase the number of aggressive acts the children committed during the hockey game, but primarily by those who had previously been rated as highly aggressive by their teachers. These kids hit others with their sticks, threw elbows, and yelled aggressive things at their opponents to a much greater extent than did either the kids rated as non-aggressive who had also watched the violent film or the kids rated as aggressive who had watched the non-violent film. 103 Likewise, a few longitudinal studies have shown that exposure to violence in media or video games has the strongest relationship in children who are already predisposed to violence. 104. Unexpected effects of media violence. Recall that at the beginning of this chapter, I asked, how had I become so casual about seeing images of brutality in Vietnam while my young son was moved to tears? There is good evidence that over time, exposure to graphic depictions of violence numbs us. We become decreasingly distressed by seeing people hurt, a process known as desensitization. People can become desensitized by watching scenes of war on the evening news, playing Grand Theft Auto for hours a day, and sadly, by witnessing actual violence, say between parents. In one of the earliest experiments on this issue, researchers measured the physiological responses of young men while they were watching a fairly bloody boxing match. 105 Those who had watched a lot of television in their daily lives seemed relatively indifferent to the mayhem in the ring. They showed little physiological evidence of excitement, anxiety, or other arousal. They were unmoved by the violence. But those who watched relatively little TV showed major physiological arousal. The violence really agitated them. Today, that bloody boxing match from a 40-year-old experiment seems tame compared to Game of Thrones or The Walking Dead. The very fact that violence has had to increase in gruesomeness and intensity to get the same reaction from audiences that mild violence once did may be the perfect illustration of the numbing effects of a diet of violence. Desensitization. A process whereby we become decreasingly distressed when we see people hurt. Although psychic numbing may protect us from feeling upset, it may also have the unintended effect of increasing our indifference to real victims of violence and others who need help. In one experiment, Brad Bushman and Craig Anderson 106 had participants play either a violent or non-violent video game for 20 minutes and then fill out a lengthy questionnaire. While doing so, the participant was allowed to overhear a violent incident erupt in the next room. A verbal argument escalated into a shoving match and then an all-out physical brawl, after which the participant could hear one of the men leave, while the other was left groaning in pain, complaining about a hurt ankle and not being able to get up. Those who played the violent video game took 5 times longer to respond to the victim in the next room. Why? Follow-up data suggests they had interpreted the incident as significantly less serious than had the participants who played the non-violent game. In contrast to the extreme violence on the video screen, the real violence in the next room felt less urgent. After all, it's hard to get worked up over a twisted ankle when you've just decapitated several armies of invading mutants. Bushman and Anderson also conducted a field study, finding that people who had just seen a violent movie took longer to come to the aid of a woman struggling to pick up her crutches than did people who had seen a non-violent movie or people still waiting to see one of the two movies. And if the person needing help is not one of us, watch out. When you are playing a violent video game, you are likely to see yourself as the hero who is blasting those evil creatures out of existence. That's fun, as far as it goes, but some research suggests it can go further. Once players get in the habit of dehumanizing the enemy, that habit can be carried over into how players come to regard real people. In 2 experiments in England, researchers found that young men and women who played a violent video game were later more likely to dehumanize immigrants to Britain, seeing them as somehow less human and deserving than native Britons, in contrast to the students who played a pro-social version of the game or a neutral game. 107. According to educational psychologists Douglas and Ronald Gentile, video games have another unintended consequence. When you are playing a video game, you are typically performing the same or similar activity, but the context changes as you advance to a new level of difficulty or change to an altogether different game. This process enhances and solidifies whatever concept is being taught. It maximizes the transfer of the learning from one situation to another. That means that if you play a variety of violent video games, you are likely to have thoughts about violence and aggression in situations that are far removed from the game. Gentile and Gentile 108 conducted a study of elementary school children and teenagers and found that those who played many different violent games were more likely to develop, over time, what's known as a hostile attribution bias. The tendency to interpret the ambiguous behavior of others in a hostile manner, rather than give others the benefit of the doubt. And by their own admission, they were also getting into more fights with their peers. Finally, another unintended consequence of heavy exposure to media violence is the magnification of danger. If I am watching all this murder and mayhem on the home screen, wouldn't it be logical for me to conclude that it isn't safe to leave the house, especially after dark? That is exactly what many viewers do conclude. A study conducted at the Annenberg Public Policy Center compared annual changes in the amount of violence portrayed on popular primetime broadcast dramas from 1972 through 2010 with responses to Gallup poll questions about fear of crime. The researchers found that the American public's fear of crime is directly, statistically related to the amount of violence portrayed on primetime TV. Even after factoring out changes in actual crime rates, people's perceptions of the crime rate fell and rose along with TV violence. The number of violent sequences per TV hour fell from a high of 6.5 in 1972 to 1.4 in 1996, and then increased to 3.7 in 2010. Each additional violent sequence per hour predicted an increase of 1 percentage point in the people who told Gallup they were afraid of walking alone at night in their neighborhood. 109 In the last chapter, one noted how the local news operates on the principle of, if it bleeds, it leads. It seems that if it bleeds, it also misleads. Taking all this research together, I conclude that frequent exposure to violent media, especially in the form of violent video games, does have an impact on many children and adolescents, although the impact is greatest on those who are already prone to violent behavior. Watching violence seems to have effects on vulnerable viewers for 5 reasons. It increases physiological arousal, it triggers a tendency to imitate the hostile or violent characters, weakening previously learned inhibitions. It triggers underlying feelings of anger, fear, or frustration. It promotes psychological numbing and reduces empathy, and it often models approved ways of behaving when we are frustrated, angry, or hurt. 110. Obviously, most people do not become motivated to behave aggressively as a result of what they observe. As social cognitive learning theory predicts, people's interpretation of what they are watching, their personality dispositions, and the social context all affect how they respond. Children and teens watch many different programs and movies and have many models to observe besides those they see in the media, including parents and peers. But the fact that some people are influenced by violent entertainments, with tragic results, cannot be denied. The elements of aggression, the case of sexual assault. We are now in a position to consider how many of the themes that have been raised in this chapter might apply to understanding one of the most troubling and persistent kinds of aggression, rape and other forms of sexual assault. Definitions of rape have changed over the decades. For example, the law used to exempt married men, who were legally allowed to have forcible sex with their wives. Today, the Department of Justice has made the definition of rape inclusive: the penetration of any bodily orifice with any part of the body or with any object, without the consent of the victim. Sexual assault is the broader term, including various other acts, but lack of consent remains the key criterion. Notice that the definition does not specify gender. Men can be sexually assaulted and raped also, although many are ashamed to admit it. Some men commit rape out of a desire to dominate, humiliate, or punish their victims. This motive is apparent among soldiers who rape captive women during war and then often kill them, and among men who rape other men, usually by anal penetration. 111 The latter form of rape often occurs in youth gangs, where the intention is to humiliate rival gang members, and in prison, where the motive, in addition to the obvious sexual one, is to conquer and degrade the victim. When most people think of a rapist, they imagine a violent stranger or a serial predator. Some rapists are exactly that. They are often unable to empathize with women, may feel hostility and contempt toward women, and feel entitled to have sexual relations with whatever woman they choose. 112 This may be why sexual violence is more likely to be committed by high-status men, including sports heroes, powerful politicians, and celebrities, who could easily find consenting partners. They equate feelings of power with sex, angrily accuse women of provoking them, and endorse rape myths, such as, women want to be raped. In fact, however, about 85% of all rapes or attempted rapes, being forced to engage in sexual acts against one's will, occur between people who know each other. Rape may occur as a result of physical force, having sex under actual or threatened violence, or through incapacitation, having sex with a victim who has been induced into a blackout with rohypnol, who is drunk or otherwise drugged, or who has passed out. Sexual scripts and the problem of consent. Everyone understands that a sexual predator who rapes a woman by overt force, threats of violence, or drugs used to render her unconscious has committed a serious crime. But what is going on with the much larger numbers of women assaulted when they are incapacitated as a result of their voluntary enjoyment of alcohol and other drugs? One answer may stem from the different sexual scripts that males and females learn as part of their gender roles in American society. 113 Sexual scripts vary according to one's culture, sexual orientation, ethnicity, age, and geographic region, and they change over time. These scripts shape what women and men learn is the right way to be sexual and popular, primarily from observations of role models, peers, and media images and messages. Who gets to ask whom out? How many dates before sex is expected? What kind of sex? Who initiates? Is any kind of sex before marriage permitted, discouraged, or forbidden? Sexual scripts. Implicit rules that specify proper sexual behavior for a person in a given situation, varying with the person's gender, age, sexual orientation, ethnicity, and peer group. One dominant script in America for young, straight women and men is that the female's role is to resist the male's sexual advances and that the male's role is to be persistent. 114 Unfortunately, this script may explain why many people argue so much over the meaning of the word no. The repeated message of anti-rape groups, what part of no don't you understand, seems obvious. Yet research finds repeatedly that no can be as hard for women to say as it is for men to hear. Many men who are following traditional sexual scripts think that no means maybe or in a little while. Some women, following scripts that say, it's okay to want sex, but be careful about saying yes too soon or they'll call you a slut, agree with them. The resulting confusion may also explain why some college women feel they need to drink heavily as a prelude to sex. If they are inebriated, they haven't said yes, and if they haven't explicitly said yes, no one can accuse them of being a slut. Further complicating matters is that most couples communicate sexual interest and intentions, including a wish not to have sex, indirectly, through hints, body language, eye contact, and other nonverbal behaviors. Deborah Davis and her colleagues 115 call this indirect communication a dance of ambiguity, which protects both parties. His ego is protected in case she says no, and she can accept without having to explicitly admit it's what she wants or reject the offer without rejecting the suitor and possibly angering him. One of Joshua's undergraduate students wrote an essay that eloquently described what happens when a woman's script clashes with a man's script. Frank Sinatra was my imaginary boyfriend. His songs filled my head with romance and thoughts of being loved and treasured, as I imagined women in my parents' era were. In college, my first real boyfriend sent me a text with a link to a pornographic movie. The text said, "You really need to work on your blowjobs. Check out my favorite porn star. Watch her technique and learn." So I watched, and I saw the source of my boyfriend's beliefs about who I was, what I wanted, and what felt good to me, and presumably what he wanted sex and romance to be. It was devastating. Both my ideas and his ideas were lies, the Sinatra fantasy just as much as Pornhub. I talked to my friends. Not a single one has ever wanted a man to ejaculate on her face, yet nearly every scene in porn concludes this way. The man's pleasure is what it's all about, and men seem to enjoy seeing women on their knees rather than on a pedestal. There is little foreplay, the conversation is degrading, and worst, women seem to enjoy rough treatment, often by more than one man at a time. My now ex-boyfriend learned virtually all his ideas about sex from porn. I wish I had known to talk about this when it occurred, there would have been so much less pain and disillusionment. Her story is not about rape or assault, yet she had not known how to talk about this with a serious boyfriend. And if she couldn't talk about this, how much more difficult would it be to say no clearly to pressure to engage in any other unwanted sexual acts? Today, as college administrators and students struggle with the problems caused by the dance of ambiguity, when to accept the accounts of victimized women, when and how to punish perpetrators, and how to handle issues of sexual misconduct when both parties had been drinking heavily, I think that these findings from social psychological research can lead us toward greater clarity and fairness. For example, as psychologists Deborah Davis and Elizabeth Loftus have written, in a he said she said situation, both sides can be right, and both sides can also be wrong. 116 The scripted sexual dance, they say, can lead to honest false testimony by both sides. She really thinks he should have known to stop, and he really thinks she gave consent. Studies find that sometimes young women, following a script that says they should be nice and not offend or anger the initiator, try to convey no without saying no, in nonverbal ways such as by stepping a few inches back, not resisting but not agreeing, or pretending not to notice the man's advances. For their part, many men are motivated to overinterpret women's nonverbal actions as signs of sexual interest rather than friendly flirting, or just friendliness. They justify their persistence. Other social psychological factors are at play in the problem of rape and sexual assault on college campuses. Cultural and social norms dictate whether men feel entitled to assault an unwilling woman or whether that would be considered despicable by their peers. Does a college, fraternity, or country endorse a rape culture that lets men off the hook, especially when the men are athletic heroes? How does a culture of binge drinking affect women's decisions about sex, and how might the think-drink effect apply? Perhaps the most important steps toward reducing date and acquaintance rape, therefore, are that both sexes understand the rules and norms clearly, to decide if they want to abide by them or resist them. Both sexes make sure that they are following a script that is in the same play. Women learn to express their wishes in a direct way, and men learn that an intoxicated woman cannot legally consent to sex and that having sex with someone who is incapacitated, even if she chose to get drunk, is immoral and illegal. Toward the reduction of violence. If we believe that reducing our propensity toward aggression is a worthwhile goal, how should we proceed? It is tempting to search for easy solutions. A long time ago, no less an expert than a former president of the American Psychological Association suggested that we develop an anti-cruelty drug to be fed to people as a way of reducing violence on a universal scale. 117 The quest for such a solution is understandable and even somewhat touching, but it is extremely unlikely that a drug could be developed that would reduce cruelty without completely tranquilizing its users. Drugs cannot make distinctions between psychological processes. Gentle, peace-loving people who are also energetic, creative, courageous, and resourceful are produced by a combination of inherited capacities, experiences, and learned values. It is difficult to conceive of a drug that could target one aspect of that combination and not another. Moreover, medical control of human behavior has the quality of an Orwellian nightmare. Whom could we trust to administer such drugs? If an anti-cruelty drug isn't the answer, let's speculate about some possibilities based upon what we've learned so far. Punishment to the average citizen. An obvious way of reducing aggression is to punish it. If one man robs, batters, or kills another, just put him in prison. Surely, living in the harsh, restrictive environment of a prison would deter that person, once released, from committing crimes, or would it? Determining the specific consequences of imprisonment is difficult. However, in most instances, it is impossible to isolate the effects of being incarcerated because too many other factors are involved. 118 Does being in prison knock the aggressiveness out of most convicts, making them less likely to re-offend when they are out, or does going back to a world that supports their law-breaking behavior have a greater impact? Although these possibilities are hard to test, evidence from a natural experiment suggests that prisons themselves fail to deter crime among the inmates who are released. A Supreme Court decision made the experiment possible, isolating the effects of imprisonment on recidivism. In 1963, after the Gideon v. Wainwright ruling that people could not be convicted of a felony without being provided with a lawyer, a number of the inmates of Florida prisons were released early, way before they had served their full sentence. The only systematic difference between these prisoners and those remaining in prison was that the released prisoners had not previously been represented by counsel. Thus, researchers could compare two groups of convicts who were nearly identical. Some had been prematurely released and others had been punished and rehabilitated to the full extent of their sentences. A startling difference emerged between the two groups. The prisoners who served their complete term were twice as likely to return to prison as those who were released early. 119. Does this mean that imprisonment fails to reduce crime? Not necessarily. This study does offer persuasive evidence that lengthy prison terms do not deter the future criminal behavior of released inmates, but it does not completely rule out the possibility that the mere prospect of harsh punishment might curb the criminal tendencies of those who have never been convicted. It is certainly possible that the threat of punishment deters many would-be criminals from ever breaking the law in the first place. Although this is possible, I consider it unlikely. For one thing, the likely punishment is far down the road, and for another, states that have the harshest punishment, the death penalty for murder, have higher murder rates than states without the death penalty. 120 What I do know is that, although severe punishment, if administered promptly, frequently results in compliance, it rarely produces internalization. If a young girl slaps her parents, siblings, or peers, we can spank her, scream at her, remove her privileges, or make her feel guilty. The assumption here is that this punishment will teach her a lesson, that she will think twice before she misbehaves again, and that the more severe the punishment, the better. But punishment, which can be effective temporarily, tends to have the opposite effect in the long run. 121 Not all children who are spanked or beaten will become violent, but what parents do is a powerful lesson in social learning, teaching their children, oh, so that's what I should do when I'm mad at someone, yell at them or hit them. If people are to establish long-term non-aggressive behavior patterns, they must, as children, internalize a set of values that opposes aggressive responses. In two separate experiments discussed more fully in Chapter 3, Merrill Carl Smith and I, and subsequently Jonathan Friedman 122 demonstrated that, with young children, threats of mild punishment are far more effective than threats of severe punishment. Although these experiments dealt only with toy preference in children, they strongly suggest that threats of mild punishment would curb aggression in the same way. As we suggested in Chapter 3, here's how it works. Suppose a mother threatens to punish her young son to induce him to refrain, momentarily, from aggressing against his little sister. If she is successful, her son will experience dissonance. The cognition, I like to wallop my little sister, is dissonant with the cognition, I am refraining from walloping my little sister. If he were severely threatened, he would have an abundantly good reason for refraining. He would be able to reduce dissonance by saying, "The reason I'm not hitting my sister is that I'd get the daylights beaten out of me if I did, but I sure would like to." However, suppose his mother threatens to use a punishment that is mild rather than severe, a punishment just barely strong enough to get the child to stop his aggression. In this instance, when he asks himself why he's not hitting his infinitely hittable little sister at the moment, he can't use the threat as a way of reducing dissonance. That is, he can't easily convince himself that he would be walloped if he hit his sister because it's not true, yet he must justify the fact that he's not hitting her. In other words, his external justification is minimal, therefore, he must add his own to justify his restraint. He might, for example, convince himself that he no longer enjoys hitting his little sister and, besides, it's wrong to hit people who are smaller than you. This would not only explain, justify, and make sensible his momentarily peaceful restraint, but more important, it would decrease the probability of his hitting his little sister in the future. In short, he would have internalized a counter-aggressive value. He would have convinced himself that, for him, hitting someone is neither desirable nor fun. This general notion has been applied with success in the real world of the schoolyard. Dan Alwius, 123, working in the Norwegian school system, was able to curtail the frequency of bullying by as much as 50% by training teachers and administrators to be vigilant to the problem and to take swift but moderate punitive action. Taken as a whole, this research indicates that children who have not yet formed their values are more apt to develop a distaste for aggression if the punishment for aggressive actions is both timely and moderate. Punishing aggressive models. Might it be possible to reduce aggression by showing children aggressive models who come to a bad end? The theory here is that as long as the violence that children see is punished, they will, in effect, be vicariously punished for their own aggression and accordingly will become less aggressive, and less inclined to mimic what they observe. Unfortunately, the evidence doesn't support this widespread belief. Experimental studies present a more precise, and complex, picture. Typically, in these experiments, children watch a film of an aggressive person who subsequently is either rewarded or punished for acting aggressively. Later, the children are given an opportunity to behave aggressively under circumstances similar to the ones shown in the film. The consistent finding is that children who watch a film in which the aggressive person is punished do act less aggressively than the children who watch a film of the person being rewarded. And they are less aggressive than children who watch an aggressive film character who is neither rewarded nor punished. 124 On the other hand, and this point is crucial, seeing a model being punished for aggression did not decrease the general level of aggression below that of a group of children who were not exposed to an aggressive model. In other words, the major thrust of the research seems to indicate that seeing an aggressor rewarded will increase the child's aggressive behavior, and seeing an aggressor punished will neither increase nor decrease the child's aggressive behavior. It is just as effective not to expose the child to aggressive models at all. Rewarding alternatives to aggression. Another possibility that has been investigated is to ignore a child when he or she behaves aggressively and to reward the child for behaving unaggressively. This strategy is based in part on the evidence that young children frequently behave aggressively as a way of attracting attention. For them, being punished is preferable to being ignored. Paradoxically, then, punishing aggressive behavior may be interpreted as a reward. Hey, Mommy pays attention to me every time I slug my little sister. I think I'll do it again. Paul Brown and Rogers Elliott 125 tested this idea in an experiment conducted at a nursery school. The nursery school teachers were instructed to ignore all aggressive acts on the part of the kids, but also to be very attentive to the children, especially when they were doing things incompatible with aggression, such as playing in a friendly manner, sharing toys, and cooperating with others. After a few weeks, there was a noticeable decline in aggressive behavior. In a more elaborate experiment, Joel Davitz 126 demonstrated that frustration need not necessarily result in aggression, rather, it can lead to constructive behavior if such behavior has been made appealing by prior training. In this study, children were allowed to play in groups of 4. Some of these groups were rewarded for constructive behavior, while others were rewarded for aggressive or competitive behavior. Then Davids deliberately frustrated the kids by building up the expectation that they would see entertaining movies and be allowed to have fun. Indeed, he went so far as to begin to show a movie and hand out candy bars to be eaten later. But then he created the frustration part of the experiment by abruptly terminating the movie at the point of highest interest and taking away the candy bars. The children were then allowed to play freely. As you have learned, this is a setup for the expected occurrence of aggressive behavior. But the children who had been trained to behave constructively played in a far more constructive way and far less aggressive way than those in the other group. This research is encouraging, but I find it necessary to state my firm belief that it would be naive to expect many children in our society to spontaneously choose constructive rather than aggressive solutions to conflicts and frustrating circumstances. American society presents us with all kinds of evidence that violent solutions to conflict and frustration are valued. Explicitly or implicitly, whether in the guise of the avenging action hero or the suave secret agent who blows people away in exotic and entertaining displays, these movie heroes demonstrate to young kids what society values and rewards. Needless to say, our exposure to violent solutions to problems is not confined to films and video games. These events dominate the nightly news, as well. Accordingly, it should come as no surprise that children learn that adults often solve their conflicts by resorting to violence, and many don't even learn that alternative solutions are feasible or appropriate. If we would prefer our children to grow up favoring nonviolent strategies, it might be a good idea to offer them specific training in these techniques, as well as encouragement to use them. As we will see shortly, there is no reason why such training cannot be provided both in the home and in school. Providing non-aggressive models an important curb to aggression is the clear indication that it is inappropriate. And the most effective indicator is social, that is, the presence of other people in the same circumstances who choose conciliation over retaliation. In a study by Robert Barron and Richard Kepner, 127 participants were insulted by the experimenter's confederate and then observed that individual receiving electric shocks at the hands of a third person. The third person delivered either intense shocks or very mild shocks. Everyone was then given the opportunity to shock their tormentor. Those who had witnessed a person delivering intense shocks to him delivered more intense shocks than those in the control condition. Those who had witnessed a person delivering mild shocks delivered milder shocks than those in the control condition. Does this paradigm seem familiar? The expression of aggressive behavior, like the expression of any other behavior, can be viewed as an act of conformity, which means that in an ambiguous situation, people look to other people for a definition of what is appropriate. In Chapter 4, I described the conditions under which you might belch at the dinner table of a Fredonian dignitary. Here I am suggesting that, if you and your friends are frustrated or made angry, and all around you people in your group are throwing snowballs at your tormentors, it will increase the probability that you will throw snowballs. If they are merely talking angrily, it will increase the probability that you will talk angrily, and alas, if they are swinging baseball bats at the heads of their tormentors, it will increase the probability that you will pick up a bat and start swinging along with them. Building empathy, picture the following scene. There is a long line of cars stopped at a traffic light at a busy intersection. The light turns green. The lead driver hesitates for 15 seconds. What happens? Of course, an eruption of horn honking, not simply a little toot designed to supply the lead driver with the information that the light has changed, but there is prolonged and persistent blasting from frustrated drivers behind the lead car, venting their annoyance. Indeed, an experiment found that, in this situation, approximately 90% of the drivers of the second car honked their horns in an aggressive manner. As part of the same experiment, a pedestrian crossed the street between the first and second cars while the light was still red for the drivers and was out of the intersection by the time the light turned green. Still, almost 90% of the second car drivers tooted their horns the second the light changed, never mind that the first driver might have wanted to make sure the pedestrian had safely crossed. But what happened when the pedestrian was on crutches? Apparently, seeing a person on crutches evoked an empathic response. The feeling of empathy overwhelmed the desire to be aggressive, and the percentage of people honking their horns decreased dramatically. 128. Empathy is crucial to human life. It is the antidote to dehumanization. If, as we have seen, most individuals dehumanize their victims to justify committing an act of aggression against them, then, by building empathy among people, aggressive acts will become more difficult to commit. Indeed, Norma and Seymour Feshbach 129 have demonstrated a negative correlation between empathy and aggression in children. The more the level of empathy, the less the likelihood of behaving aggressively. Norma Feshbach 130, who has pioneered the teaching of empathy in elementary schools, designed a 30-hour empathy training program for children. The kids had to think hard about questions, such as, what would the world look like to you if you were as small as a cat? And, what birthday present would make each member of your family happiest? Thinking about the answers expands children's ability to put themselves in another's situation. The children also listened to stories and then retold them from the point of view of each of the different characters in each story. The children played the role of each of the characters, and their performances were videotaped. The children then watched the tapes and talked about how people look and sound when they express different feelings. At the end of the program, the children not only had learned to be more empathic but also had higher self-esteem, were more generous, and were less aggressive than were students who had not participated in the program. Georgina Hammock and Deborah Richardson 131 demonstrated similar benefits of empathy in studies of college students who were placed in a situation in which they were instructed to deliver electric shocks to a fellow student. Those who had learned to feel concern for the feelings of others delivered less severe shocks than those who were less empathic. Kenichi Obuchi and his colleagues, 132, working with Japanese students, found the same thing. Obuchi instructed students to deliver electric shocks to another student as part of a learning experiment. In one condition, prior to receiving the shocks, the victims first disclosed something personal about themselves, thus opening the door to the formation of empathy. In the control condition, the victims were not afforded an opportunity for self-disclosure. Students in the disclosure condition administered much milder shocks than those in the non-disclosure condition. Teaching altruism and mindfulness. A powerful antidote to aggression is altruism, doing something for others, even at the cost of our own immediate comfort or pleasure. Altruism makes us feel good. It relieves the unpleasant emotions we feel when we see others suffer, and giving to others is repeatedly found to elevate our mood more reliably than giving to ourselves. For example, it turns out that in terms of happiness and well-being, how people spend their money is at least as important as how much they earn. Using 3 different research methods, Lara Aknin and her colleagues 133 investigated this question. One measure was a nationally representative survey, the second was a longitudinal field study of how people spent unexpected, windfall income. In both studies, people who spent money on others were happier than those who spent it on themselves. But of course the results could work in either direction. Does altruism cause happiness, or do happy people behave more altruistically? So the researchers did an experiment in which participants were randomly assigned either to spend money on themselves or on others. This time they pinned down the causal sequence. Behaving altruistically produces greater feelings of happiness. As we saw in discussing social cognitive learning theory, how we think about events, how we perceive, interpret, and explain something that might normally annoy, frustrate, or anger us, is a crucial intermediate step in determining how we respond. That is the reason for the final antidote to aggressiveness I want to mention, mindfulness and forms of meditation, which teach people to focus attention on the present moment. In practicing mindfulness and meditation, people reduce reflexive, aggressive responses to a perceived provocation or insult, giving a person time to reflect and decide how to respond more calmly and constructively. People who are being mindful would disagree with statements like, "It seems I am running on automatic, without much awareness of what I'm doing," and the goal is precisely to enable them to become aware. In experiments, even a brief session of mindfulness training reduces mind-wandering, unfocused thoughts that impede the ability to pay close attention to the task at hand. While occasional daydreaming is fine and pleasant, habitual mind-wandering predicts worse mood, greater stress, lower self-esteem, and less concern for the welfare of others. 134 Its benefits are therefore physical, emotional, and behavioral. 135. Meditation has similar benefits. Meditators are instructed to pay attention to sensations in the present moment, rather than being caught up with memories or images pertaining to the past or future, memories and images that typically produce anger or anxiety.